The series kicks off in the past, with Franklin and Irene York initially encountering each other in a bar. Following a stroke of luck on the pool table, Franklin discovers a pretext to initiate a conversation with Irene, and the rest, as they say, is history. Jump ahead to the present approximately 50 years later, and both Irene and Franklin are a happily married couple. However, Irene was confined to a wheelchair, and Franklin maneuvers her outside so they can gaze upon the stars. Together they venture to the shed, descending via the underground passage to an unusual entrance. Inside, they're inexplicably transported to the stars, a Martian observatory platform. Franklin had observed Irene's increasing desire to view the scenery over the past year or so. They visited there a total of 865 times, and more frequently since her accident. Franklin endeavors to delve into what's transpiring, eventually confessing his weariness of continually ascending to the platform. He had his fill and yearns to relinquish their clandestine responsibility to another. However, Irene remains convinced that this is their enigma to unravel. One of the most intriguing figures here is Byron, who coincidentally resides next door. He is convinced that Irene and Franklin are concealing something in their shed and is resolute on uncovering it. Franklin certainly doesn't appreciate him, regarding the man as an intrusive annoyance, and when he attempts to tend to their lawn, Franklin brushes him off entirely. Byron also aspires to run for mayor, although his partner Janine harbors doubts. Irene consults a physician who wishes to conduct examinations, suspecting her symptoms are worsening, yet what she's diagnosed with remains ambiguous. Meanwhile, Franklin goes out for lunch with his granddaughter Denise, and she's troubled by rumors from a neighbor that they're wandering around at night for walks. Franklin dismisses it as merely stargazing, but Denise remains skeptical. She's concerned and suggests the notion of them relocating, and Franklin vehemently refuses. During Franklin's absence, Irene departs from the doctor's office and visits an acquaintance at the care facility. The acquaintance happens to be Sadie, who pays her a visit. Unfortunately, things take a downturn when Irene notices Sadie's deteriorating mental health. Needing to confide in someone, Irene reveals to Sadie that she's unique and has been journeying, but is also gravely ill. Upon Franklin's eventual retrieval of Irene, they journey home together, and both exhibit signs of weariness, with time serving as a harsh mistress, eroding fragments of their cognition. This time, Franklin bears the brunt, succumbing to senility and forgetting crucial tasks, such as refueling the vehicle and fetching Irene from appointments. Back at home, they discuss the inevitability of mortality, and Irene implores Franklin to lead a fulfilling life and move beyond the confines of their home should she precede him in passing. Following a delightful evening together, Franklin drifts into a slumber while serenading Irene. However, Irene, feeling restless, opts against sleep. She's grown tired of waiting and leaves a note for Franklin, informing him that she's embarking on her own path while she still has the chance. Irene pledges to reunite with Franklin, ascending to the Martian terrain, leaving a note by the chair and preparing for exit. Before she does, she notices an individual lying on the floor, wheezing and pleading for assistance. As the second episode opens with Franklin awakening in the morning to find Irene crawling toward the house, she breathes heavily, asserting that there's an intruder in the shed. Armed with a hammer, Franklin descends the stairs and discovers the stranger doubled over. Franklin was convinced that the man is a drug user seeking refuge, but Irene isn't so certain. The situation was ominous, and the man is covered in blood, yet lacks any apparent wound, and thus Franklin calls the police. Officer Thomas arrives and conducts a thorough search, with the camera focusing on Franklin's back, displaying a blood spatter across his right shoulder, likely from carrying the stranger. Just before the officer leaves, Irene discreetly informs Thomas that Franklin's mental state is deteriorating, implying he may be hallucinating. The officer departs, seemingly convinced that Franklin's account was a product of hallucination. Running alongside this narrative is another involving Stella and her daughter Tony. They're traversing the mountains, leading llamas across the hill, far removed from Tony's school. That evening, Tony invites Matthias over under the impression of forming a friendship, but Matthias was actually dared to visit the haunted house for money. Tony, crestfallen, discovers the truth, and when Stella encounters them, she sends them away and proceeds to the rear of the church, revealing a door similar to the one in Franklin and Irene's shed. Back with Franklin and Irene, the stranger collapses and begins convulsing, and Irene suspects it resembles a virus that she had in the past, and sends Franklin to replenish their supply of Tamiflu. During his absence, Irene rummages through the stranger's belongings, finding gold coins and a photo labeled Gabriel. With the stranger coughing uncontrollably, Irene prepares a concoction to erase his discomfort and reads from his book. Eventually, the stranger, now identified as Jude, awakens, uncertain of his origins. He recalls falling and being carried, presumably by Franklin. Franklin returns with the medicine, but he's less trusting than Irene, and he barely interacts with Jude, focusing on tending to Irene as she feels faint. Meanwhile, Denise struggles to stay awake during her lecture, and Cliff, nearby, offers her coffee, sparking a connection between them, providing insight into the family's dynamics. Denise shoulders the responsibility of caring for Franklin and Irene, complicated by her father's suicide when she was 5. Franklin confronts Irene about his secret that she kept, particularly regarding Dr. Maresa's advice. She pledges to follow the doctor's instruction, but requests Franklin's support in exploring the meaning behind the doorway, and reluctantly he agrees. Returning to Stella, she finds an old acquaintance has broken in, inquiring about Tony's training. His identity remains unclear, but he may be connected to the doorway. That night, after Franklin warns Jude not to harm Denise, Jude awakens and takes Denise's letter and sneaks out, wielding a knife in the bathroom. He cuts open his leg, revealing a cylindrical object, which he crushes before departing into the night. The third episode commences with Franklin unraveling the mystery of these golden coins. As per the merchant in town, they resemble Spanish doubloons, yet their origin remains uncertain. Upon returning home, Franklin brings along a bag of garments for Jude. However, he adamantly refuses to part with any of Michael's belongings, as the memories still linger painfully. Amidst this, Jude begins to recollect fragments of his past life and the events leading him to the Yorks, including a confrontation with an individual. Meanwhile, Tony and Stella persist in entertaining a stranger lurking with them in the wilderness, and apparently he collaborates with someone named Iffy, and Tony is deemed next in line. Another subplot unfolds involving Denise, who receives a lucrative career opportunity from her superior Mark. A new research group was being established, promising substantial financial rewards, albeit demanding a significant time commitment. With her internship workload doubling, Denise grapples with indecision as stress mounts. Byron faces criticism for falsifying signatures in his campaign, following a previous instance witnessing in his last episode. A complaint was filed against him this time. On Irene's instruction, Franklin takes Jude out for some male bonding, and after several rounds of chess, Franklin suspects Jude of being a con artist and hands him $5,000, escorting him to the bus station to depart. Yet as Jude boards the bus, Franklin experiences a change of heart, reluctantly allowing him to return. Back at home, Irene stumbles upon an unusual trinket concealed amongst Jude's possessions, and this orb seemingly disintegrates matter, as evidenced when Irene places it on a coffee table, causing the entire table to vanish. Denise pays a visit to her grandparents, where she encounters Jude for the first time, and her grandparents claim that he serves as a caregiver, but Denise harbors suspicions. Following Irene's advice, Denise opts not to stay the night and instead lodges with a friend, determined to uncover Jude's true identity. That evening, Jude confides in Irene, revealing his purpose for being there to find his father, Gabriel. His name echoes from the Polaroid seen previously, and he seeks Irene's assistance. Franklin discovers a blood-dried knife in the bathroom. While turning on the tap, he notices remnants of a peculiar trinket from earlier surfacing in the water. Unfortunately, the water washes it away before he can inspect it closely. Despite being called out for his earlier meddling, Byron sneaks around and ventures into the York's shed basement. As the episode draws to a close, the focus returns to Stella and Tony, and Stella guides her daughter behind the chapel to the familiar doorway seen before, albeit with a slight difference. The peculiar control panel outside serves as a means to manipulate their destination, and after inputting some commands, they enter together and find themselves transported to New York City. Episode 4 opens with Franklin maintaining his skepticism toward Jude's narrative. Upon discovering the blood-dried knife, he sets off to consult Officer Thomas, aiming to conduct a DNA test to uncover Jude's true identity. However, Thomas dismisses Franklin's concerns, perceiving his blend of suspicion and conspiracy theories as sign of mental instability. Meanwhile, Jude delves into the records and uncovers his father was arrested for vagrancy, claiming amnesia at the time of arrest. When Irene shares this revelation with Franklin, he responds with a quip, suggesting a genetic predisposition for such incidents. This curious thread begs further investigation, and Tony and Stella find themselves collaborating with their contact Nick, who leads them to an abandoned warehouse where a machine spews out random numbers, revealing serial numbers, and while Nick can narrow down their search, he insists on accompanying them to pinpoint the signal precisely. Tony remains puzzled about the situation, anticipating clarity with time, and Denise stays overnight at Katie's place, expressing the overwhelming stress that she's experiencing, and meanwhile Byron takes a drastic step by burning all his campaign signs. Back at the house, Irene confronts Jude about his secretive demeanor, prompting him to express gratitude for her care despite his reluctance, and when Dale from the pawn shop calls, Jude pretends to be Franklin's son, discussing the valuable gold coins, which visibly unsettles him. Subsequently, Jude contacts an individual regarding the gold coins, receiving a cryptic response: Fiat voluntas Dei, Latin for God's will be done. Irene compensates Jude for his work and assures him of her support. Following a brief encounter with Chandra, Jude sees it's Chandra's business card and heads to the local bar. It turns out that Chandra had stolen a valuable item from him, a rectangular slab glimpsed previously. Coincidentally, Denise and Katie were also at the bar, and Denise approaches Jude, and they bond over shots and drinking. Byron arrives at the pool hall and engages in a few games with Franklin, and despite initial hostility, they form a genuine connection, and Franklin confides in Byron about his love for Irene, while Byron shares his own relationship struggles. Both men get very drunk, and outside the bar, Byron acknowledges underestimating Franklin, and he expresses curiosity about the mysterious doorway, prompting Franklin to agree to show him. Descending into the shelter, Franklin attempts to activate the doorway, but it fails to transport them anywhere. Byron, incredulous, perceives it as a prank or a peculiar dungeon. Meanwhile, Irene wakes to find Jude missing and sets out to locate him, and as she drives, she encounters Jude being apprehended by the police, bringing back memories of the time prior to being arrested. It becomes evident that Jude had stabbed his assistant multiple times, shedding light on the bloodied knife discovered earlier. The opening scene of the 5th episode shows Irene in the police station, displeased with Jude for running off, and he pleads with her to assist, but the only way out of the situation is if Irene knows the truth. They control everything, Jude eventually confesses, as he opens up, and Jude reveals that he's only been kept isolated in a compound in the middle of nowhere to protect the secrets. That secret, of course, is the doorway, and no one really knows who built them or why, but for Jude, the alien planet is simply a desolate wasteland rather than a symbolic key to something greater. The blood on Jude from the night was the one from the men who tried to prevent him from escaping, and Jude explained that these individuals find him, and if they do, they'll kill him, making for a precarious situation. It appears the man he killed was one of these attackers, and Jude's main goal here is to locate Gabriel, who also passed through the same doorway, allegedly. Irene persuades the officers to release Jude, and on the way home, Irene downplays the significance of her door, but according to Jude, this is all part of destiny and is one of the most important doorways out there. Meanwhile, Tony, Stella, and Nick shed light on the scientific and mystical dimensions of the doorways, but when a utility worker shows up in his van, it was up to Stella to take care of him. Stella incapacitates the man, securing him to the steering wheel with cable ties, and when Nick returns to the car, a stunned Tony watches in silence as they receive their next destination, Illinois, which is where Irene and Franklin reside. Meanwhile, Franklin visits Byron with a disposable camera, and he urges him to get the photos developed, pointing out that they'll provide proof of the alien landscape, and while this unfolds, Irene visits Chandra's place to retrieve what she initially took from her last visit. As Irene keeps Chandra occupied, Jude sneaks upstairs, where he retrieves the strange black trinket we saw before. However, also he discovers a necklace containing the same strange object that was in his leg. Jude abandons his cover, heads straight toward teleport downstairs to confront Chandra, and she claims it was a gift from those at the care home, her way of obtaining something in return for caring for all those people. Irene promising to keep everything a secret in exchange for knowing where she obtained the necklace. Now, this cylindrical trinket is actually a tracker, which explains why Jude removed it from his leg and destroyed it several episodes back. With this revelation, Chandra also discloses where she acquired it, and Byron gets the photos developed and notices several pictures of the alien world, with both Irene and Franklin in front of the camera. Byron inevitably conducts some online research, delving into conspiracy theories, and he eventually comes across one called the Impossible Door, and believes this could be what the doorway is, and was actually sketched by an Argentine missionary back in 1723. Franklin notices bloody fingerprints by the side of the doorway. As Byron shines a flashlight on the area, he realizes that this is a control panel, the same control panel that we saw Stella's doorway possesses. Anyway, when they open it up, the orb is obviously missing, and it's in the jar that Jude buried earlier in the season. Given Byron had actually seen him out in the woods, Franklin's nosy neighbor ventures out and uncovers the jar and the orb. The 6th episode begins with tensions at the dinner table, and Irene talks about how she's been teaching Jude how to drive, and Franklin was indifferent to the whole affair, eventually excusing himself and taking out the trash, and in doing so, he discovers Irene's letter, and when he shows Irene, Franklin's world crumbles around him. He confronts Jude about the turmoil he's causing in the house and how his eventual arrival has changed everything. "You sure about that though?" Jude challenges, as Franklin eventually leaves. Meanwhile, Tony and Stella make it to Illinois and check into a motel for the night. However, Nick starts fooling around with the orb he's brought with him and in front of a companion in his room for the night no less, and Stella shows up and pays the companion and reminds him of what happened to his brother and how dangerous this is. The next day, Nick taunts Stella at breakfast, bringing up her brother Caleb and their resemblance. Stella delivers a solid punch to his nose, takes the van and leaves him stranded, sporting a bloody nose. Byron eventually catches up with Franklin and reveals that he's found the orb. He's pretty excited about the whole affair, but Franklin dismisses him, claiming that he has other priorities. At the same time, Denise decides to drop out of school. Her friend isn't pleased, leading to Denise leaving and joining Jude on his mission. After the intel gained from Chandra last episode, he learns a little more about his father. He was picked up by a hitchhiker but followed by some suspicious individuals in a car. After losing their trial, Gabriel removed the tracker from his leg, just like Jude did. Back at the house, Franklin confronts Irene about the unfulfilled promises and how he's clearly not enough for her to want to stay. He's torn apart by what happened, and it's evident that this marriage was on the rocks. While they struggle to work through their marital problems, Byron heads down to the shed, places the orb in the control panel in the basement, only it doesn't seem to work as they don't have enough power. Jude decides to go on the road trip to Michigan, following the trail of where his father had gone. It's pretty a remote area that they're heading for, but Irene decides to tag along, craving some adventure in her life. Franklin, however, does not, and for him, their marriage had always been enough, but for Irene, she's been searching the purpose for something beyond her current life. In her absence, Franklin reveals a call regarding the doubloons, and he's confused given that it was Jude who originally answered the phone. However, he does learn that they're very rare, and Dale wants to know where he got them from, but Franklin was puzzled and hangs up, but just in time as well. Byron had something to show him. Leading Franklin down the basement of the shed, he reveals a large generator running, and Byron intends to charge up the circuit and in turn provide some crucial power for the doorway to start functioning. After connecting everything up, the ensuing battle sends shock waves across the neighborhood, and lights flicker on and off, birds fall from the sky, Stella and Tony receive a notification about the exact location and take off. In the basement, Franklin and Byron teleport themselves up to the alien viewpoint, and it was a breathtaking vista, and Byron was very much so amazed. He expresses a desire to go outside, but this time Franklin admits he's no longer afraid. Episode 7 begins with Franklin showing Byron the spacesuits that he's been designing, and despite working on them for years now, he hasn't been able to summon the courage to actually use them. Byron was determined to remedy that and get these suits up to standard, and meanwhile, Irene, Jude, and Denise Denise embark on their road trip to Michigan together. They arrive at the address in question, where Jude hands over the Polaroid of Gabriel to the owner of this house, a woman named Hannah. She recognizes who Gabriel is, and he was long gone, and he departed 15 years ago. Gabe and Hannah were romantically involved, but she has no clue where he went. In fact, he vanished without a trace one day. With the trip seemingly futile, Irene considers heading home, but Hannah suggests that they stay for the night before moving on. Irene struggles to reach Franklin, but hears a strange noise coming from upstairs, and Hannah dismisses it, but there's definitely something suspicious going on. It doesn't take long for us to discover what's happening, as Hannah sneaks into the concealed room with a guy named Paul was sitting at his monitor watching everything. He plays Franklin's voicemail, noting that it's the same person who inquired about the coins, and Hannah suggests that they establish contact before returning to entertain the others. Back home, Byron skips Janine's barbecue but refuses to divulge what's happening with Franklin, and it's here Janine admits that she doesn't want to be uprooted or humiliated anymore, which makes Byron realize that she's the one who tipped off about the forged signatures anonymously, and Janine confesses that she just wants him to be ordinary, but for Byron, he's always had grand plans for his life. Meanwhile, Irene doesn't believe Denise deserves her affection, and she burdened her with guilt after what happened to Michael and feels she should have done more to aid her father. "I'm sorry," she says, tears welling up in her eyes, and they embrace as more flashbacks involving Michael shed light on his debilitating depression and deteriorating condition. Back in the present, Tony notices a video of Jude performing karaoke and talks to Stella, who confirms that this is the apostate that they're pursuing. While Stella starts tracing his movements, Tony calls Nick and requests assistance, and meanwhile, Byron and Franklin finally complete the spacesuits. Heading up to the observation deck again, Franklin watches as Byron ventures out into the alien terrain. As he traverses the landscape, he chuckles and remarks that this is like a paradise, communicating through a radio. He disappears from view, believing he's found some furniture. "You won't believe this, Frank," he excitedly exclaims. As he vanishes from sight, he also ceases communication. Franklin fears the worst and eventually hangs his head, listening to the static in the observatory deck alone. It seems that Byron was gone, and Franklin struggles to come up to terms with what was happening, and finding it difficult to compose himself when Jude and the others return later in the day. Frank claims there's nothing to report, but he's clearly consumed by guilt. Irene takes Denise down into the shelter and explains what's been happening with her, and she recounts how it was difficult for her to continue living after Michael's suicide, and believed that the portal was a way of helping her cope with the grief, scrambling to find some sort of connection between the two events. Irene confesses that she just wanted to shield her from this portal, but since Jude arrived, everything had been spiraling out of control, and Denise was unhappy about these lies and eventually walks away. Down at the shore, Tony and Stella meet up with Chandra, and alongside that shadowy antagonist from before, he hands over the gold doubloons worth far more than $3,000 that Chandra was demanding in exchange for information. This shadowy figure learns where Jude is staying and breaks Chandra's neck, and retrieving the gold coins, he vows to ensure Stella doesn't remain soft. With that, he incinerates Chandra in her car as Tony watches in shock from a distance. The season finale opens with Jude heading out to the spot in the garden, breathing heavily as he realizes that the orb is missing. While he scrambles to make sense of all this, Franklin returns to the observatory deck, attempting to locate Byron. He was still not responding and seems to be lost, and when Franklin returns to the garden, a very concerned Janine appears, questioning him about her husband. Franklin brushes it off, reassuring her that he'll return soon, and back inside the house, Jude confronts Franklin about the orb and the dangers of their venture. He tells Franklin that there's absolutely nothing on the alien planet but endless dusty wasteland. Meanwhile, Stella and Tony discuss their predicament, and Stella admits that there's nothing that she can do to stop this stranger, as they can't even just flee, because the shadowy forces at work will send another their way. The man notices dead birds on the ground outside, and he informs them that they're close. He leads Tony over to the York house, but along the way, he reveals to her that Caleb is actually her father and not Stella's brother. With this revelation, Tony arrives in the garden, and Franklin was held at gunpoint, escorted inside by the mysterious man. While this unfolds, Jude catches up with Denise, thanking her for her assistance back at the bar, and these exchanges are soon interrupted by Stella showing up and firing at Jude. Jude. He dashes into the woods to evade her, drawing her away from Denise. However, Denise rushes back to the York house and finds herself held at gunpoint along with her grandparents. The stranger uses Denise to extract a confession from Irene regarding the location of the doorway, and after he departs and heads to the shed, Irene consoles a very frightened Tony. She no longer believes that the trio are following God's will and cites Chandra's death as evidence for this. The stranger decides on a change of plans and informs Stella, and part of this plan involves using the family as leverage while the apostate is brought to the house. When Jude arrives, the man strikes him on the head, and it turns out that she sent him, but the details of the cryptic conversation remain unclear. Franklin seizes an opportunity to try and subdue the man, leading to a significant scuffle, and the ensuing result sees the stranger tasered, bound, and gagged. With him in the back of the truck, Stella and Tony decide to depart and travel far away, and Stella and Tony hit the road, with Stella informing her daughter that they won't be able to return to their old house. They also have a bargaining chip now, meaning the stranger. Unfortunately, these positive moments are short-lived as they're forced off the road by shadowy figures, led by Hannah, who is revealed to be working with them. She greets Cornelius, the name of the stranger in the back of the van, covers his head with a bag and taunts him, and meanwhile, Jude decides to take Denise to the doorway and leave, and they both head to Bangkok. Irene also decides that they shouldn't utilize the doorway as frequently, dismissing any potential mystery that could have been in place, and Franklin appreciates his wife's change of heart, but simultaneously realizes that his task is not yet complete. He confides in Irene about what he's been concealing, including Byron's uncertain fate, and he resolved to venture into the wilderness and retrieve Byron. "And I believe in you, Franklin. I always have," Irene says, embracing her husband and handing him the mask. The pair is sent to the alien planet again, where Franklin steps out into the wilderness, and in doing so, he discovers a lifeless body on the ground, a knife lodged in their chests. As for Franklin, he notices something amiss with the oxygen supply and soon loses consciousness. Irene catches up with him and, taking a leap of faith without a spacesuit and encouraging him to breathe, after removing his helmet, the pair walk together, where they stumble upon a peculiar community nestled in a small alcove as a bell begins ringing in the distance.
And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our recap. Like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.